Maryam, it's so lovely to have you on our podcast. Thank you so much. It's just such a privilege and a joy and an honor. And I'm just so grateful that you found some time to just sit down with us and have a chat. Um, I think we talked just before we started recording that we're kind of going to do
Mm.
two parts. That there's lots of things I'd like to kind of ask you about and discuss, and then you're going to kind of talk about from your perspective what it's like um,
Sure. Yeah.
to be the lecturer. So for people unaware, as most people will be, Mariam is the wonderful course leader on
Yeah.
my course. One of the people that really that's organized a lot and has sorted out a lot and helped us with a lot of
Mhm.
the joys and the challenges of counselling training. Mariam's there and
Yeah.
solving all sorts of problems. So it's a pleasure to have her and to have this dialogue between us. Um, I've got a couple of bits of just an
Mhm.
introduction, just to give people a bit of sense,
Sure.
um,
Yeah, sure.
if that's all right. So you're an
Mhm.
integrative BACP accredited psychotherapist through Therapy for You with Maryam Riaz, which is the name of your private
Yeah.
practice. You're also a clinical supervisor and obviously a lecturer and a course leader, as you said, at Leeds Beckett University. You offer
Yeah.
therapy in English, Urdu, Hindu, and Punjabi. You were the first
Yeah.
woman of color to start a counseling practice in Little Germany, in Bradford. You co-authored a chapter
Yes.
of
Yeah.
this amazing book, The Handbook of
Yeah.
Social Justice in Psychological Therapies. Um, and as I say, so I'm a final year. I've known Mariam for about 18 months now, and
Yeah.
it's just been a joy. And I've been telling her all about Task and everything we've been going on, and she's
Yes.
incredibly
Yeah. All the
encouraging.
wonderful work you do. Yeah.
Yeah. And she's been like, tell everyone about this. And I think you called me out in a lecture once, just kind of randomly, like, Robbie's been involved in
Yes,
some
we
of this
did.
stuff.
We shared it with and you were very modest, Robbie. You were very modest, and I thought it's really important. I think, any kind of social justice work, it's so important to share. And I'll talk a little bit about that later because it's a collective community issue, isn't it? And I shared it just recently. You came to speak to our first year students, and I shared all the information about the work you do with them. So it's gone out to them as well.
Thank you. Yeah. And for me, like, I mean, TASC is great because it's a national community, but
Yeah.
most people only know digitally, whereas I think this is the first time we've not been face to face and had a chat. So it's lovely to kind of to have that connection
Yes.
as well
Yeah.
and know that there's people in my real world, in my not my offline world that care about these things as well. So
Yes.
it's just
Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
affirming.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I wondered if we might start, Ma'am, just if you could just give us a sense of kind of your journey. So I'm aware you were the only person of color in your counseling training course, what that experience was like,
Yeah.
why kind of maybe why you got into therapy and kind of just your experiences of being the racial minority in training and then
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah. Sure. So, I guess my journey into kind of counselling, psychotherapy, and in particular, kind of like my modality, working relationally, and in an integrative approach, and also, I've got a research interest in how we work with faith identities in therapy too.
Mm.
But it really kind of started my whole interest in psychotherapy training was when I worked in the hospital chaplaincy team. So I worked in an NHS trust in Bradford for over 16 years.
Mm.
And it was a wonderful, wonderful privilege to work in the chaplaincy team. And then I worked alongside our clinical health psychology, mental health hospitals in psychiatry too. Because at the time when I joined the NHS, there was very little cultural awareness and faith awareness around mental health. So although I was kind of chaplaincy based, as a resource, we were kind of working as part of multidisciplinary teams across the hospital, and in particular clinical health psychology and psychiatry. And for me, the interest in kind of counselling and psychotherapy started after I initially did my training in Islamic psychotherapy because that really supported my kind of spiritual and pastoral work in chaplaincy. And I often, feel that spiritual branch of Islam is not always available, not always accessible. And I think when we look at psychological growth, psychological development, it's a model, just like any other kind of existential sort of philosophy. So for me, it was a profound kind of learning journey, but also personal insight as well, and my personal reflections and self-development. And then that led me to kind of put into practice the approaches and techniques into my chaplaincy work. And the beauty of the chaplaincy work was kind of short term. So I felt, it was like we were journeying with, so carrying very kind of sort of messages and values of existential kind of psychotherapy philosophy, journeying with, offering hope. And then that led me to sort of counselling and mental health, because I thought it's often a bittersweet moment when the patient was discharged. We don't really see them again, but that their journey continues. So I entered like mainstream counselling and psychotherapy training. When I first started my course, I was the only person of colour. And I think, because I also trained at Leeds Beckett before I started working there, and I think the course does address working with difference, but often I felt moments where it was almost a burden of responsibility, being the only person of colour. Almost felt like being the spokesperson or representation for all kind of faith identities, or kind of all people of colour, or global majority identities. But it didn't kind of sink in until the professional practice training, when I went out onto placement, that actually it meant that my journey as a trainee, I had to work twice as hard. I had to work twice as hard to kind of understand to be able to understand and articulate and work with psychological therapies and theories, but then to be able to practice with them in a frame of reference that was culturally very different. So, for example, one huge difference is in Western culture, we talk about it's a very individualistic culture. It comes from I. And the Eastern culture, the self is in relation to others, so other relationships, other families, so it's part of more of a collective culture. So I was drawn to kind of lots of existential theories and philosophies to help me align that difference. So, for example, I've got a huge appreciation for like Buber, I, thou, and I, it kind of relating and working with relational depth. And I think I experienced that kind of working at I, thou level when I worked with patients in the hospital. So it was wonderful that I could experience and those existential kind of understandings into my psychotherapy work. But like I said, it felt like I had to work twice as hard. And I felt, when I set up my practice in Bradford, very diverse city, although it's wonderful, absolute honour and privilege to be the first woman of colour, first person of colour to set up a counselling supervision service in Bradford. It's also a little bit sad to think that a city as diverse as Bradford didn't have that kind of provision for Black, Asian, global majority kind of clients and families. So I had a couple of options because I'd already trained in like my Islamic psychotherapy. There were options that I could have just focused as like a niche service provider and just work with particular identities. But my passion was to kind of embrace mainstream practices and mainstream services, and that's where my motivation started to kind of also come into academia, because I felt that it should be the mainstream services, mainstream training providers that adapt and adjust and accommodate for different cultural awareness, different cultural philosophies, rather than people like me train and then just work in a niche market. And the reason I call my practice Therapy for You is because I wanted it to become accessible for everyone. So how mainstream a BACP-accredited course can cater for absolutely everyone. It can cater for people from different cultural heritage and faith heritage. So I set up my practice, really, really successful in running one-to-one. And I think because I was the only person of colour, I often got work to work in the community sector. So I've done working with women's mental health, working with refugees. So it's been really, really humbling, and I'm really grateful for all the clients that I've been able to kind of support and journey with. But whilst I was in private practice, it did kind of take me back to the days where I was the only person on my course. And I felt if we want to create a systemic change, it has to start with the training providers, because it's the training providers that are recruiting and sort of training the next generation of therapists. So having the next generation of therapists that are more diverse was really important. Again, rather than, people of different cultural and faith identities working in niche and independent services, I felt mainstream services should be able to cater for cultural differences. So I started working part-time with Leeds Beckett. I was a part-time tutor for a while, and alongside running my private practice. But my area of interest in wanting to kind of decolonise the curriculum and sort of diversify our sort of student cohorts just grew more and more, and then the opportunity came for a full-time post, and I applied. And one of the first projects that I was involved in was a scholarship programme with a mental health charity in Leeds called North Point. So this was just after the pandemic. So the Black Lives Matter movement had taken place. So there was more kind of discussion and dialogue about racial identities and representation and equity and inclusion. So, and North Point it does work at the heart of the certain communities in Leeds. So it was a natural kind of relationship with them. So we started the scholarship to offer funding to recruit people from Black, Asian, global majority communities, because it was often recognised that one of the challenges was economical. So people couldn't afford to enter the profession because of sort of economical strains and constraints. And I must say, since the last couple of years, and myself and my colleagues at Leeds Beckett are hoping to kind of publish a piece of work on this, we have noticed the increase in the student cohort in terms of diversity and representation since we've started the scholarships. It's absolutely remarkable. And for me, I remember when I first started, and I used to stand in front, and present and teach when I was lecturing to a very white cohort with the odd Black or Asian person. But now, like your cohort, Robbie, as well, it's very diverse. And I think part of the scholarship is the financial support that is offered to students, but it's also raised awareness. And I think that's the biggest thing for me. It's raised awareness if we're talking about kind of introducing systemic change. It's shown representation. You've got me, a woman of colour, on the teaching team too, and it's kind of inspired people. And it's inspired kind of communities to think that this is a profession that they can enter, this is a profession that they can train into. And I think my kind of journey to that sort of does continue then with my passion for the social justice work in counselling and psychotherapy. So it feels like, yes, now I'm here, almost like a sense of responsibility, but not in a burdensome way, in more of a passionate way, because I think, one thing I ask, for example, when we do teaching on social justice is, the one question I ask all the students is, whose responsibility is social justice? And it's everyone's, because everybody wants to live in a society and live in a community that's fair and equitable. We want to offer our clients that fairness and equity. And if we truly want to work at a relational depth, and if we want to truly offer the core conditions, like Rogers would say, the client needs to receive your empathy, needs to receive the core conditions. If we truly want to do that, then it's hand in hand with our understanding for social justice, because I feel, and this is the message that I give to all trainees and students, is that you should be able to work with anyone. If you truly want to kind of embrace that humanistic philosophy, then your work should be accessible to everyone. And that can be uncomfortable at times, because it involves kind of doing that internal work on yourself, that personal and deeply kind of professional reflective aspect, which we do on our course. But I think it's a huge part of the work. And if we truly want to kind of live out the values of social justice, as well as kind of speak to them, but to actually live them out in our practice and bring them into the therapy room with a client, then that work needs to be done. That work needs to be done first. And And one of the models that I've been drawn to, and kind of I'd say had a huge impact on my life, is liberation psychology. Because at times when I felt marginalised, at times when I mentioned earlier, where I felt like almost a burden of responsibility, at times I did wonder, couldn't contextualize what my experience. There wasn't a book that I could pick up and read. There wasn't yes, I have my faith. I draw a lot of strength from prayer and worship. But to kind of contextualize it into a personal and professional development aspect, which I have to do as a practitioner and also had to do as a trainee. And liberation psychology was that. It offered me liberation. And it made me kind of appreciate and understand some of the challenges and burdens that people of colour have. And that if I truly want to kind of work with equity and inclusion and want my therapeutic work to liberate my clients, I had to, kind of do that work on liberation myself too. And there is a quote from the book on page 81, the heart of liberation psychology, the first starting point of it is, in order to kind of liberate others, one must liberate themselves first. One must understand their own internalized racism, their own internalized oppression of whatever marginalized identity that may be. And the deeper the work we can do on ourselves and liberate ourselves, the better attuned we'll be to our clients. And I think if that aspect is not done, I would question how attuned a person can be to their clients, because if there's always going to be unconscious bias, if there's going to be projection, anything that gets in the way of that relational encounter is going to kind of get in the way of being kind of attuned to your client's needs. And attunement and immediacy is really important when we're thinking of offering the core conditions to our clients.
Yeah. I want to just
That's
acknowledge.
a long-winded answer, Robbie.
No, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I felt myself welling up when you were telling your story, and the journey you've been through and the challenges. It's so inspiring. I think I'm sure people listening will be inspired. And it's just, thank you for sharing all of that. And just at the end of, I think, to me, that's one of the biggest things we want to do is around on this podcast and in task in general is that thing of, what can therapy contribute to social change and vice versa, and that work on your internalized oppression, your internalized racism, or the internalized stuff. That, and for everyone, that's often, if you can do that work first, and then people do it in all sorts of contexts, but particularly in a political context of where do your biases come from? Gender biases, it could be a trans bias, or it could be all sorts of things, and then you bring that, and then your client that's had real world experience of, I say, transphobia or racism or bigotry of any form. Then you can really, maybe you've got some learning about, okay, well, I know what it's like to have those prejudices, but also I've done the work on it, and I can actually understand. And then from the other point of view of I get this is a real problem. This isn't something that some therapists might kind of pathologize or might say, okay, well, that's just transference, but actually this is a real world problem. Mm-hmm. And how do you work with that in the room, knowing, how, the outside world exists. We're not just in this little, what is a microcosm. And it's just fascinating. And I think that liberation psychology, that's the big, because there's lots of liberation. There's a theology, there's economics, but the psychology, to me, that's the most interesting, is because it really goes into, well, what are the narratives you've been told growing up, living in Bradford. Yes, it's, as you say, it's, it's a very multicultural city, but it's not in that multicultural county in general, or in a country that has all sorts of long history of colonialism and oppression and racism. Just it must be,
and also like many diversities, and it does have, and I think that this is an ongoing debate, and it's also been researched many times too, is that it does then create kind of segregation. We mustn't, have just this sort of fantasy ideas, Freud would say, of multiculturalism or diversity. But actually there is segregation. So there are pockets of the city that will just be one particular demographic, certain schools that will only have students from a particular demographic. And I think that was the shift that I didn't want to kind of go into. And the shift that I wanted to create is for, again, why should I, as a practitioner, because of my cultural faith identity, just work in a niche service and offer? I could do that. I've got the language skills, I've got the cultural context, I've got years of experience of working in sort of the mental health and healthcare profession. So, and working in the community setting too. I could have done that. I could have worked with just a particular demographic. But again, my passion was, if we want to create that systemic change, and part of liberation psychology is framing and recognizing that liberation isn't like an ecological model. It requires systemic change. It requires personal change. It requires community collaboration and a community-centered approach. So that's why I was really firm in kind of saying actually we need to take these ideas to the mainstream course providers. We need to take these ideas to like people like the membership bodies and the BACP to kind of recognise the importance of inclusion, away from just being like a tick box exercise, away from, because I remember when I first started teaching, quite a common phrase, and I'm sure you probably hear it as well, it is, I'm offering the core conditions. So I'm being non-judgmental, I'm being empathic. And I used to read that in the assignments again and again, and it did make me wonder, that's okay, that's what we want the core conditions, of course we do, but you're not recognising within the core conditions the absence of empowerment. Recognising that there's power differentials. Inherently, the therapist has power. So when you're offering the core conditions, if you layer that, if you look at it from an intersectional lens, you've got then racial differences, gender differences, socioeconomic differences. So the core conditions should also kind of embrace and understand the power dynamics. And if we're talking about empowerment, or in the case of liberation psychology, liberation, we must address the differences. We must address the systemic differences, the systemic injustices that people feel. And I think out of all of the core conditions, congruence for me is the most important, because, again, starting with that sense of liberating yourself is, being congruent with yourself first as a therapist, recognising your own challenges, your own assumptions, your own prejudice and your own biases that may get in the way of your client receiving your core conditions, and recognising the power dynamics, the systemic differences, to be able to truly be present, so your client, as Roger says, receives the core conditions.
Yeah, I'm really interested in kind of how those maybe models come together and then the communities come together in terms of, you starting in the Islamic model of counselling and then going on quite a white course and maybe feeling part of both, and I don't know, maybe not fully part of both, and then kind of both on a kind of community level and kind of a friendship and colleague level, but also kind of on a theoretical level of having the Islamic model, but then having a Carl Rogers model. And I know Carl Rogers is maybe more open to political influences than maybe something more classical psychodynamic. But I'm curious kind of how those fit with you in terms of holding both identities and being part of both communities today.
No, that's a really interesting question. And I think the response to that for me, and I think this is what is missed in Islamic faith identities, and I guess the kind of judgments I receive on a daily basis, and in particular, if there's anything happening across the world that affects Muslim identities, then because of my visible faith identities, I do become an easy target. I've been into shops, Robbie, and people have not served me because of my and this is, in Leeds, this is the here and now. Right. So it's kind of recognising that those differences do happen, and I think since Brexit, etc., it's really brought to the surface is people's kind of ideas of racism, and for me, what it misses is the humanistic element of faith with humanity, which all faiths believe. All faiths, surely at the essence and core of all faiths, it's about humanity. So the way I aligned my kind of understanding with my mainstream Western Eurocentric models was that actually my core philosophy. So as you'll know, one of your key theory assignments is for you to describe your practice rationale. So describing my practice rationale, for me, it had to align with my sense of being, who I am, and my kind of life philosophy, as you can call it, and that's my faith identity. And people often miss out that humanistic element of faith. So that's how I kind of reconcile the difference between Western kind of Eurocentric models and how it aligns with faith identity, is that humanistic philosophy. However, the gap in that is that the Western Eurocentric models of psychotherapy, or the ones that we teach, and I think Leeds Beckett, I'm really privileged to work with a really great team that, we're doing a lot of work in kind of decolonising the curriculum. And again, it's not just a tick box exercise of decolonising, where we have books and references from different authors of different racial identities. It's making that epistemological change. So for me, how I reconcile the difference between Eastern and Western kind of philosophies, that got me through. However, part of that critique in my work was that actually the theories that we teach need to make space for alternative and different epistemologies. So by that, what we mean is how knowledge is viewed and shared. So Eastern understandings of self, for example, and how that can align with mainstream. So for me, that's a huge part of what we're doing in kind of decolonising the curriculum. And liberation psychology offers that too. It offers an alternative kind of framework that recognises people's lived experiences, recognises, the first time I read about racial trauma, it was liberating for me because I never realised that I was carrying all of that from, like, the examples that I've mentioned. Rather than being able to kind of bring it to the surface, it was unconsciously kind of internally being suppressed and leading to my internal oppression. And what that leads to is burnout. It leads to that sense of feeling burden, feeling responsibility. It can lead to illness, things like migraines, headaches. It can impact on your body because, as we know, trauma is kind of carried in the body. So just reading about something like racial trauma was validating and empowering, and that for me was kind of liberating. And then also recognising that healing is also collective as well as individualistic. Yes, that relationship, that therapeutic relationship you have is one-to-one with the therapist, but it's the therapist recognising that somebody's healing is also collective. So collective in terms of addressing systemic injustices, social injustices, recognising the importance of what we call kind of radical healing and radical hope that comes from healing as being part of a community approach, rather than just the burden just on the individual. And I think the liberating aspect for me was to kind of understand the difference between, when working with things like racial trauma, is understanding the difference between coping and healing. They're two very, very different things. So often, when I started off my training, for example, so working with things like racism, homophobia, aspects of oppression, was to kind of like coping strategies. We'll empower the client and we'll offer the core conditions. But actually, if we look at alternative like epistemologies, like I said, we're looking at different theoretical frameworks. And for me, what liberation psychology offered was coping versus healing, because they're two different things. If we want to truly make that systemic change in working with social justice, it's about recognising that healing needs to take place. So this idea of what we call radical hope and radical healing. So it's using the term radical in an empowering context and not with all the negative connotations that we hear about it. Right. So it's a huge kind of what I'd say like epistemological shift in kind of coping versus healing. And I think that's where that kind of systemic change needs to be taking place in terms of our approach to social justice and working with oppression and working with like prejudice and bias.
Yeah, and I remember reading about radical hope,
Mm.
radical healing in your wonderful chapter,
Yeah,
and it just seems so integral. And like, yes, everyone needs to be
yeah,
talking about this today, right now, because it's so
yeah, yeah,
timely. And I love that.
yeah,
I hadn't really thought about the reframing of radical when it's certain newspaper was always use it in a
yeah,
certain way, but
yeah,
actually we can use it in a much more positive, constructive, proactive way of, and you say
yeah,
of rather than coping and well in its a different context of coping and healing. I think that's really strikes a chord
yeah,
of it's active and it's not
yeah.
just bearing things, but it's we've got work to do and there's things to be done. Mm.
Yeah, and that's what kind of also creates that shift in. And when we do talk about decolonizing, that
Mm.
it's introducing alternative ontology to kind of look at how we view things in a different way, how we understand behavior and how we understand oppression. Most importantly, is kind of framing that understanding of oppression that because often, as a therapist, if you feel your client is being oppressed, do you want to rescue? Do you want to offer them kind of build their resilience and offer them coping strategies? All those things are great, and we do need them, but we need them alongside healing, that kind of internal healing too.
Yeah.
And I think at the heart of the internal healing is what liberation psychology would kind of describe as like critical consciousness, raising that critical consciousness. And I think that's where my internal healing happened, that raising my critical consciousness, like recognizing and validating my experiences of racism, and sort of recognizing that it's not me, it's actually a thing. People do experience it. It has a psychological impact as well as like a mental and physical impact, and it does lead to that kind of an internal oppression. And I think that's why I found personally like liberation psychology is one of those aspects that really changed my life. That critical consciousness. Also, when you experience racism, it makes you doubt your own identity. It's almost like gaslighting. It makes you doubt yourself. It makes you doubt your identity, and it just which marginalises you further because it's that's what othering does. You become kind of categorised, whether it's a faith identity, racial identity, or sexual identity, and I think that critical consciousness awareness and as part of kind of that radical healing was embracing that I can be proud of who I am. I can be proud of my identity. I can embrace that and still be, working in a Western secular kind of institution, and that it's okay rather than feeling isolated and marginalised. And often one of the things that people would do in those situations, and it's quite common, and I'm sure that the listeners will be able to connect, that people of colour code switch, for example. So you kind of assimilate to the whiteness, and kind of reduce any aspect of your identity that is non-white, whether it's the way you talk, the way you present yourself. But unfortunately for me, I've got visible faith identity, so I couldn't assimilate too much. But I recognise, again, part of my radical healing was that I didn't need to do that. That it was okay for me to kind of embrace all aspects of my culture, too, because you do then also, when you experience being marginalised and racism, doubt your culture a little as well, and just kind of reconnecting with your heritage, to build your confidence, to build your critical consciousness that it's a systemic issue, it's a social issue, and that's why we need an ecological kind of model towards healing, not just a kind of straightforward. I'm offering the core conditions, I'm offering resilience, and I'm offering coping strategies for the client to get through.
I so agree, and
Yeah.
I'm really grateful that you shared quite a lot of kind of personal things that you've gone through. I'm really curious, like
Yeah.
as we sit here, kind of now, do you get a sense of kind of where you are in your journey, kind of healing and processing or whatever you do, and all of those horrible experiences and all that racism you faced? Is it kind of an ongoing battle for you in terms of? I mean, I'm sure you still face racism, or do you feel like you're quite
Yeah,
confident in
it
when
is
it happens?
ongoing. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. That's a really good question, Robin. I think it is ongoing. But part of my work, like I said, was just finding a framing and understanding that it's not just me, and not internalizing things. And I think what supports me, and what I'd say to everyone is, again, if you have an aspect of privilege in your identity, how you can support either friends, peers, or your clients is allyship. And I think allyship is so important if kind of moving forward, if you're able to kind of, as a person that's experienced racism, if I'm able to kind of move forward, then to kind of continue with that journey is having good support from allies too, people that I can share my internal oppressors with, people that can journey with, that can accompany. And part of the radical healing in liberation psychology is this sense of accompaniment, like accompanying and journeying with people. And I think that's like allyship. You can offer allyship to your clients too, whereas you can't share and be in their lived experience, but you can accompany. You can kind of, in spaces where people don't have a voice, you could be that voice for them. And I think that's not taking away people's voices. It's just sometimes in certain spaces in where there may not be equity in terms of representation and inclusion, if you can be that voice for someone, that's liberating. And that's how I think, if we want to create that true kind of systemic change in social justice, it's allyship is so important too.
Yeah. And I wonder, have you had maybe good experiences of allyship or bad experience of allyship? Like, what's that of the white colleagues or friends that have tried to
White colleague, absolutely. My
Yeah.
team is wonderful. Like Viv, you'll know them probably.
Yeah.
Like we've got Viv, Sable, Dr. Viv Sable, Val, Fletcher, Paul, fantastic course director and team leader, and Sue and Caroline. All of our team. Matt is fantastic as well, and Katie, and anyone that I've missed, I apologise. But the team are fantastic. And one thing, because a lot of the team do have understanding of working with marginalised identities, and are kind of like advocates for social justice too. They recognise what allyship is. And for me, allyship is giving people a voice, not being their voice. That's the difference. I think being somebody's voice can be disempowering, because then you're taking away the power of somebody being able to kind of have their own voice. But supporting somebody to find their voice, supporting somebody to feel empowered, to have a voice, that's real kind of allyship. So it manages out the power dynamics. And also, the important person is the person that's been marginalised and feeling oppressed. And if you kind of come in as an ally and think that you're going to be their voice, then that's taking away their empowerment. So it's about giving somebody a voice, or supporting them to find their voice. I think that's good allyship.
Yeah.
And I think that allyship contributes to that kind of radical healing, and that's where radical hope is about allyship as well.
Yeah. Just conscious of kind of the time we're on. I don't know if we just want to kind of, we talked about kind of shifting a little bit and talking about kind of maybe our dynamic and kind of what's it like to kind of be lecture student and kind of and be on a kind of a professional, semi-professional podcast and yeah, I don't know, was there something you particularly wanted to ask, or did you maybe I just kind of share where I'm at?
I think and I think and I'm really grateful for the opportunity, Robbie. Thank you so much, because I think with work like social justice, it's who is it important for? Is it for the academics? We could write about it, we could publish, do research, which we love to do when we get the time. But really, the work is for the community. The work is for the professional community, and it's also for our kind of community that are seeking help and support. So I think taking academia to social roots is really important. So the social justice work, taking it to the heart of the community. And I think that's what I like to do. So, like, for example, I've done a lot of work in the community projects, like in Bradford. I've worked recently with the Bradford Chambers of Commerce to kind of inform mental health practice. So it's kind of taking the knowledge to the community, to grassroots. So it has a social impact. Because if we want to really create that kind of systemic change and really kind of live out the values of social justice, then I think taking the social justice to people, or taking these new ideas and new learning to the community, will create that shift. And I think that's why I love my job. And I think that's one of my passions of staying and working in academia, is doing the research aspect. It's an absolute privilege to be in that place where we can publish, where we can research, like I said, when we get the time. But it's what we do with that research that I also think the kind of social impact of the research is really important. And if I could leave with like 3 top tips, I'd say to like your approach, if you're new to social justice, or you're new to kind of want to really sort of work in an anti-oppressive way, and really, even adapt like approaches of liberation psychology, do read our wonderful chapter. But 3 top tips I'd like to leave people with is, first of all, approach difference with curiosity rather than judgment. Because judgments, as we know, can lead to prejudice and unconscious bias, etc. And I'd say approach with curiosity, and recognise the difference in the power dynamics. So, for example, often when we approach with curiosity, is we don't want to make the client do all of the hard work because of their marginalised identity. So, tell me a little bit about your lived experience, etc. But you still want the work to be therapeutic. So, it's about naming and recognising the difference too. So approaching it with curiosity, and also just simple terms like saying to your client, for example, I recognise that there is a difference, and I recognise I've got some learning to do for it. So it doesn't burden the client that they have the responsibility of educating the therapist, for example. So approaching with curiosity and not judgment, it will make your work a lot easier. It'll take the pressure off you, because sometimes working with social justice, people have fear. They fear they may get it wrong. They fear that they may embarrass or shame themselves or others, and they fear that they don't want to kind of get things wrong or be accused of any aspect of kind of racism or homophobia or anything like that. But if we, again, like it comes back to what I said earlier, congruence is one of the most important core conditions. And if we approach it with curiosity, and then the other aspect is like be congruent, and it connects to this idea of, if we want to truly liberate ourselves, is work on your sense of congruence. And again, the more personal and professional development reflections you do, more inward kind of reflections you do, recognise where you might get things wrong, recognise you have judgments. We all have judgments, Robbie. We walk out the door in the morning and we have certain perceptions, certain judgments, but it's what we do with them. And that's where congruence comes in. So the second top tip would be remain congruent. And the last one would be, because I think they all kind of connect then, especially the congruence element, is liberate yourself. I'd love to give people the gift of liberation, because I think that's where true empowerment is. It's a bit deeper than just empowerment. Now, I'm empowering my client. I'm giving them, coping mechanisms, strategies, etc. They're wonderful for building resilience, to do the therapeutic work, but for long-term impact, and to create, even in your micro relationships, the small kind of practice that you might have, you can introduce social justice, and you can introduce systemic and social change, and it comes with kind of liberate yourself too. So they'll be my top 3 tips, just to end the session with.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much, Maryam. This has been my favourite episode I've done. So it's incredible. And thank you so much for your time. And it's lovely to see you. And yeah.
No, it's been brilliant, Robbie. Thank you so much. And I'm sure, one thing that I wanted to end on actually is, just as a student, how have you found it? Your experience as a white student, on a course, being taught by a woman of colour, or being taught things like social justice as well. How have you found it?
Yeah, it's made it feel really relevant. Like we could spend all day reading the theories and like, okay, that's cool. But actually,
Yeah,
we live in the real world with real people with real issues. You know, as you say, my course is quite diverse. There's lots of different people from lots
yeah,
of different backgrounds, and to kind of to miss that completely in the training would have felt very weird. So it's been great. Being taught by a woman of color doesn't hasn't bothered me. My teachers at
yeah,
school were quite white. It was quite a white school in general.
yeah,
But it hasn't. It's felt natural, and most of the teaching you've done has been around. I've been around Western. I've been around other theories as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
So you've talked about all sorts of things. So I don't think of like, oh, Maryam only talks about X, Y, Z. So I,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
been,
and that's
yeah, it's
important.
been really
Thank you. Yeah,
encouraging and inspiring to hear about your journey today and to kind of
yeah,
to meet you and to be on a course where you're so you can give people so much because of the role that you're in and the amount of work that you do. So yeah, it's there's always more that universities can do, but the fact that you're where you are
yeah.
and the fact that you have been such an important part of my training has been massive. Yeah.
It's been, oh, thank you, Robbie. And I think, just to end on, it's been a privilege as well, because I think, again, part of the social justice work is that we've been able to have lots of dialogues too, to
Mm.
unpack a lot of that learning in terms of what it will look like in practice, and kind of offer that feedback of how you can then take that into placement and work with clients. So it's been wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Oh,
Thank you, Miriam. I better
amazing.
let you go, but that
Yeah,
lovely to
no
see you
problem.
and
It's
thanks
been a
again.
pleasure, and thank
It's
you.
been such
Thank
a
you so
pleasure.
much. Yeah.
Great.